most of the things that are causing depression and anxiety, and certainly the factors that are causing them to rise, are not in our biology. They're factors in the way we live. And once you understand that, it opens up a whole different set of solutions.
Why do you think depression and mental health issues are rife at the moment? What do you think is causing this kind of glut, if you like, of depression, anxiety, addictions, and other mental health issues too?
So there's 9 causes for which there's scientific evidence. And I think it's really interesting to think about what the last year and a half can teach us, right? So we've all gone through this enormous global pandemic, and depression and anxiety have significantly increased. There's been a huge rise in diagnosed depression and anxiety, and indeed addiction-related deaths, people drinking themselves to death, people overdosing on things like heroin, massive increase, right? And in a way that's not surprising to any of us. It intuitively makes sense when we think about the trauma we've all gone through. But if you think about this story that we've been telling for so long, that it's just a problem internal to your brain, just a biological problem. Well, if that was the case, this wouldn't make any sense, because it's not that our brains all mysteriously began to go haywire a year and a half ago, right? What happened is the society changed, the way we live changed, and that caused an increase in depression and anxiety. That should tell us something about why depression and anxiety were rising before the pandemic. But let's look at an obvious one of the 9 causes, right? Loneliness. I spent a lot of time interviewing the leading expert in the world on loneliness, an amazing man named Professor John Cacioppo, who's at the University of Chicago. And he did loads of incredible, he sadly died recently, but he did loads of incredible work. Firstly, he proved that loneliness causes depression and anxiety. I know that might sound like a bit of a no shit Sherlock finding, but actually until him, people had said, well, maybe it's just that you become depressed first and that makes you lonely.
Yeah.
And that happens sometimes, but he proved it goes the other way too, right? Loneliness causes depression. He also proved, really importantly, loneliness has massively increased. And I remember one time thinking this through with him, I remember him saying to me, why do we exist, right? You, me, everyone you've ever met. Why are we here? One key reason is that our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. They weren't bigger than the animals they took down a lot of the time. They weren't faster than the animals they took down a lot of the time, but they were much better at banding together into groups and cooperating. Just like bees evolved to live in a hive, humans evolved to live in a tribe. And we are the first humans ever to disband our tribes. And it is making us feel absolutely terrible. So that's one example. I can talk about lots of others if you like.
Yeah, I tell everyone, all my clients, because I've worked with thousands of addicts, and I tell everyone, look, when you're born, you have 2 drivers: find connection, avoid rejection. A baby knows that if my mum connects to me, I will survive. And we understand that surviving used to be a numbers game. And now, and of course, that wasn't that long ago that we died of rejection. When my father lived in Northumberland, they had a little church. I think it was an 11th century church, and it had a banishment window. And that meant that if you didn't conform, the village would cast you out, but you still had to go to church, and you had to turn up just after the service began. And you had to crouch down by this banishment window and join in, but you had to leave before the service ended because you were banished. And even in Romeo and Juliet, when they cast him out, he said, well, I'd rather die than be cast out. There's nothing outside the city walls but purgatory. And so we know just from literature that banishing, marooning a difficult sailor, putting someone in isolation, casting people out is the worst punishment in the world. Isolating people, sending your kid to the room. We have, the mean girls at school that isolate one person, and yet it's so bizarre that we've actually live in a world where we isolate ourselves. We live in an apartment, maybe a coach online. Amazon delivers everything. We don't have to see anyone. And I find it so odd that we've almost chosen a life of enforced banishment, also knowing that it is the most effective, punishment. We know that prisoners who go into solitary, the most disruptive, the most affected, they need more help than the rest of the prison population put together. So why do you think we live in a world now where we're kind of choosing this kind of banishment, this isolation?
I think it's related. I think there's lots of reasons. I think it's related to one of the other causes of depression and anxiety that I write about in Lost Connections, which is that it's about a corruption of our values. So
Yeah.
everyone knows that junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? I don't say that with any sense of superiority. As you can see from my chins, I'm very well acquainted with the KFC menu. But so just that we know that junk food appeals to the part of us that needs nutrition, but actually poisons us. And a kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick. For thousands of years, philosophers have said, if you think life is about money and status and showing off, you're going to feel like shit, right? That's not an exact quote from Confucius or Schopenhauer, but that is basically what they said. But weirdly, nobody had ever scientifically investigated this until an incredible man who I interviewed a lot called Professor Tim Kasser, who's at Knox College in Illinois, just retired. And he spent 30 years investigating, well, is this true, right? How do your values affect all sorts of aspects of your life, including whether you become depressed and anxious? And Professor Kasser discovered loads of things, but for the purposes of our conversation, Marisa, I think he discovered two really important things. Firstly, he discovered the more you think life is about money and status and showing off, the kind of values we get from advertising and Instagram and everything like them, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious by a significant amount. And secondly, he showed as a society, as a culture, we've become much more driven by what I would call these kind of junk values, right? So you think about, at some level, this might almost sound banal, right? Everyone watching knows none of you are going to lie on your deathbed and think about all the shoes you bought and all the likes you got on Instagram, right? You're going to think about moments of love and meaning and connection. But Professor Kasser showed from the moment we're born, we are pumped full of this alternative value system that carries us away from what we intuitively know that we need. More 18-month-old children in the United States know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name. So from the moment you're born, you're immersed in this machinery that says, if you don't feel good, there's a solution for that.
Yeah.
Buy things, show them off to make other people jealous. We're fed a kind of KFC for the soul. It teaches us to go against our own best instincts, which at some level we all know, of course, you find meaning in life through connection with other people, with meaningful values, with nature. It takes us away from that towards just this extreme individualism that teaches us actually you'll be happy when you are making a kind of isolated achievement for yourself. It's interesting you mentioned Zimbabwe, because I was thinking as you said that about one of the really interesting other different piece of research that I looked at for the book. There's this woman called Dr. Brett Ford. She was at Berkeley when I interviewed her. She's in Toronto now. And she was involved in this big piece of research that I think really helps you to explain what you're saying about Zimbabwe, but also this question about loneliness. So they did this research. They wanted to discover something. They wanted to investigate something basically quite simple. They wanted to figure out, let's say you, Marisa, decided you were going to spend 2 hours a day deliberately trying to make yourself happier. Would you actually become happier? And they did this research. She was part of a huge international team. They did this research in 4 countries. They did it in the United States, in Japan, in Taiwan, and in Russia. And what they discovered at first seems really weird. In the United States, if you deliberately try to make yourself happier, you do not become happier. But in the other countries, Russia, Taiwan, Japan, if you try to make yourself happier, you do become happier. And at first they're like, well, what's going on? How could that be? So they studied it more. What they discovered was in the US, if you try to make yourself happier, in the main, you do something for yourself, right? You buy something, you try to get a promotion, you show off on social media, whatever it would be. So we have an instinctively individualistic idea of what it means to be happy. In the other countries, in the main, of course, there are exceptions on both sides, but in the main, if you try to make yourself happier, you did something for someone else, your family, your friends, your community. So we have an instinctively individualistic idea of what it means to be happy. And they have an instinctively collectivist idea of what it means to be happy. And it turns out our story about happiness just doesn't work very well, right? The things we've been told make us happy don't make us happy. In fact, they take us away from happiness. So this is not the only thing that's going on with loneliness, but there's these deep underlying stories in our culture about what it means to be a human being, about what it means to be a successful human being, about what it means to be happy, these deep stories that we just think are part of the world, how the world is, that actually drag us in the direction of loneliness, isolation. You know, if you think life isn't about relationships with other people mostly, but it's mostly about individual achievement and showing off, well, that's going to lead to a very different kind of life, one where you are much more likely to be anxious and depressed. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, and that's of course what happens in social media. I meet people who say, I've got 500 friends. I met someone recently I was working with who said, you know, I put a post and then he all night he's looking for how many likes this post got. I'm like, hello, girlfriend is here. But he's really connecting with a phone. He's connecting with people. And I see so many teenagers who are in their early 20s and their whole life is about my social media presence. How many likes have I got? How many followers? But they're not even real. If you say I'm having a really bad day and I've got the flu, no one's turning up with chicken soup because they're not there. And I think it's really a tragedy that we've allowed people to connect to a screen. I know in Japan, you can now rent a friend. They actually have robots to keep old people company. It's like, well, what kind of world? In Japan, they've got this thing where they've got women in their 50s actually preferring to go to jail, not wanting to leave, because jail is a bit like girls' boarding school. There, you connect with people, you have someone to talk to, you wake up every day with someone to talk to, or your laundry gets done. And they say it's a real problem that they actually prefer being in jail with other women to being in their solitary life in their apartment, not seeing anyone. So I do wonder what we're doing to the world. I mean, when I was in Dubai a couple of years ago, I saw that all the baby strollers had iPads in them. So the baby is facing away from the mum, and they're doing this. I go to restaurants. When I used to take my little girl to a restaurant, she had crayons and a piece of paper. Now they have their phones and they're all playing. And many clients say, you know, my kid's getting really angry because they want screen time. You know, it's so funny. We used to, you know, when I was growing up, we used to go out to play and our parents couldn't get us in. Now they can't get their kids out to play because they're on their screen. So do you think we're looking in completely the wrong place for the solution to depression and addiction?
Yes, and I think you've gone to a really important thing. I wanted to understand this more, this question about our obsession with screens. So one of the places I went to was the first ever internet rehab center in the world.
Wow.
It's just outside Spokane in Washington. It's called
I want
Restart
to do
Washington.
that.
They're super interesting people. You should talk. You should have as a guest Hilary Cash, the doctor who
I
runs
will.
super insightful women. Remind me, I'll introduce you to her. But I remember going there. It's called Restart Washington. I remember arriving. I remember the car pulling up, and it's like a clearing in the woods, right? It's a lovely, gorgeous center. And I remember absolutely instinctively, I looked at my phone and felt irritated that I didn't have any cell phone reception to check my email. And I was like, oh, wait, you're in the right place, right? But it's really interesting because they get all sorts of people in this rehab center, but they disproportionately get young men who become obsessed with online multiplayer role-playing games like World of Warcraft. It would be Fortnite now, but that didn't exist when I went. And it was fascinating talking to these young men who were very articulate about their problems and extremely likable. But afterwards talking to Dr. Cash and her saying to me, you've got to ask yourself, and you know this very well from the world of addiction yourself, Marissa, she said, you've got to ask yourself, what are these young men getting out of these games? Because
Yeah.
they're getting something out of it, right? And she said, actually, they're getting the things that young men used to get from the society, but they no longer get. So they get a sense that they are seen by other people. If you're playing an online role-playing game, at least other people see you, right? You get a feeling you're good at something. We have a school system that mostly makes boys feel incompetent and stupid. They get a feeling they're moving around. Like you said, they hardly ever leave their homes. The figures for this are extraordinary. Kids just don't go outside in the US and Britain anymore.
No.
Exactly. But what they're getting is a kind of parody of those things, right? Or a kind of hologram of those things. I started to think as I spoke to them, because a lot of them had also become completely obsessed with porn. In some ways, I think the relationship between social media and social life is a bit like the relationship between porn and sex, right? I'm not totally against porn. It'll meet a certain basic itch, but no one after looking at porn for an hour feels satisfied and held the way they do if you've had sex, right? If at least if it goes well, right? We didn't evolve to look at each other through screens. We didn't evolve to have sex through screens. We evolved to look at each other in this three-dimensional way. And we've all, of course, seen that. You know, we're talking through Zoom. We've all had infinite Zooms during COVID. If screen-based interactions were satisfying as normal interactions, we would have all been fine talking to each other through Zoom. In fact, we all hated it, as we all know. But I think that helps us. When I was at Restart Washington, it helped me to think a bit more deeply about this, because it's tempting to say, oh, the screens are what's making us depressed. I think it's slightly more complicated. So you've got to think about the moment when screens arrive. So for most of us, it's the late 1990s, the early 2000s, when a lot of the things we're talking about, like loneliness and junk values, had already been really progressing for a lot of years, increasing for a lot of years. And what happens is the internet arrives and it looks a lot like the things we've lost. We've lost friends, but here's Facebook friends. You've lost status in the economy. Here are status updates, but it's not the thing we've lost. So it's a curious thing where actually what's happening with the internet is it's an attempt to fill the hole that's left by all these unmet needs, but it's not a successful attempt to fill that hole, right? It, in fact, often takes us further away from meaningful values, from other people, not in every case, but in a lot of cases. So I think it's a complex relationship there, but I think you're totally right. And Professor Jill Twenge has done really good research on this, showing, you know, I mean, it's contested, but I think it's quite persuasive that this is really increasing. It's an attempt to solve our depression and anxiety that actually, in most cases, increases our depression and anxiety.
Yeah, because there's no touch. You know, I was talking to somebody recently, a man, about his young daughter. He said, you know, I read her a story every night on Zoom. I'm in a different state to her, but, you know, and then I spoke to someone else who hasn't seen her daughter for a year and a half. And she said, no, it's amazing. We have FaceTime every Monday for 9 weeks. We're more connected ever than we were when I lived in the same state as her. And I'm like, but that can't be, because where's the touch? You know, I love my daughter, I love my husband, but our whole relationship about hugging, holding hands, giving someone a cuddle, rubbing their back, going, it's okay. But you can't do that on a screen. It's just so bizarre that I meet parents who say, well, I have screen time. I can understand the grandparents. I think that is a great thing. They're far away. You live in Australia, and how cool that the grandparents can come and talk to you. But a lot of my friends, I think, you know, I parted from my husband and he's got screen time, and I can't make my 3-year-old be on the screen with her dad. She's bored out of her mind. She wants to run around. But I just find it bizarre that we think a screen relationship is as good as a real one. And when parents say to me, you know, I have quality time with my kid on the screen, I go, well, try going on a date that way. Try meeting someone saying, hey, we're just going to meet on the screen every day and have a date, and that's just as good, isn't it? And they'll go, no, of course it's not as good. How can we look into each other's eyes and hold hands and flirt on the screen? So I think we've sold people something really disingenuous, rather like we sold people antidepressants. In fact, many years ago, a client came to me and said, hey, you know, I couldn't have sex with my husband. I was so depressed that I couldn't have sex with him. So I went to the doctor, and now I'm on Prozac and I still can't have sex. And you know what? I don't care anymore because I'm now numb. And I thought, well, that's just bizarre that you have the same problem you had. The difference is you no longer care, that you're not connecting with your husband. And of course, great sex with someone you care about creates oxytocin. And instead, she had Prozac. So do you think that we are no longer responsible enough for our outcomes? I wonder in the world if we're allowing Facebook and Netflix to entertain us. We're allowing DoorDash and Uber Eats to send us food, and then we go on a screen and hang out with a group. Do you think that we are forgetting that, you know, responsibility means an ability to respond, to be responsible for our outcomes and our situations?
I think there's a lot in that question. I think you framed it the right way, which is you use the word we, not I or you, right? Because there's a moment in the research for the book where there were quite a few moments in the research where I just realized I had to reframe how I thought about something. But one of the biggest was when I went to interview this South African psychiatrist called Dr. Derek Summerfield. And Derek happened to be, it's very related to your Zimbabwe point as well. So Derek happened to be in Cambodia in 2001 when they first introduced chemical antidepressants for Cambodians. They hadn't had them in Cambodia before. And he was researching something else. He was just there by coincidence. And the local doctors, the Cambodians, were like, oh, what are antidepressants? They'd never heard of them. So he explained, and they said to him, oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants. And he said, well, what do you mean? And they told him a story. Because he thought they were going to talk about some kind of herbal remedy, right? Like St. John's wort or ginkgo biloba. Yeah. No, they said, so they explained that there was a guy in their community who worked in the rice fields. And one day he stood on a landmine left over from the war with the United States, and he got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial limb. And after a few months, he just goes back to work. He goes back to work in this rice field. But apparently it's really painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial limb. And I'm guessing it's fairly traumatic to, like, you know, go back to the field where you got blown up. The guy started to cry a lot. After he developed what we would call classic depression. After a while, he just refused to get out of bed. The Cambodian doctors said, well, that's when we gave him an antidepressant. And Dr. Summerfield said, well, what was it? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realized that his pain made sense. Actually, you only had to sit with him for 5 minutes to understand why he felt the way he did, right? One of the doctors figured, if we bought this guy a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was screwing him up so much. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. They said to Derek, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been raised to think about depression and anxiety the way we have, that sounds like a joke, right? I went to my doctor for an antidepressant. She gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively is what the leading medical body in the whole world, the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not weak, you're not crazy, you're not in the main a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is love and practical help to get those needs met. And the reason I was thinking about that in relation to your question, Marisa, is because what's so important to me, there's so many important things about that story and the science that reinforces it. But to me, one of the most important things is what they didn't say to that Cambodian guy. They didn't figure out, oh, okay, you're being made depressed by your environment, by factors in your life. So it's your job to fix that now. It's on you, buddy. You got to sort this out, right? They didn't say, if they had said that, it would have been completely pointless. The guy couldn't solve it on his own. What they said is, you've got a problem in the environment. That could have happened to me, could have happened to anyone. We will now intervene and together change your environment, right? And I think that's what's crucial, because there's one way of talking about this that I think is not helpful, or that's going too far. So when we're talking about it, which I think has limited some value, but it's pretty limited, which is to explain these things and then say to people, okay, so let's think about loneliness. It's to explain to people, okay, loneliness is causing a huge amount of the depression and anxiety around us. So come on now, pull yourself together. Obviously, I'm not saying, you're not saying this, Marisa. Pull yourself together and get out there and go and meet people, right? That there are alternative approaches which are based on we, not me, that are much more effective. So I'll give you an example, a very practical one that every doctor's office in the world should be doing. So one of the heroes of Lost Connections is a doctor called Sam Everington, who's a general practitioner in East London, poor part of East London, where I lived for years, although sadly Sam was never my doctor. And Sam was really uncomfortable in a way that I think you are, Marisa, because he had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, he's not blanketly opposed to chemical antidepressants. He thinks they have some role to play, but he could see two things. Firstly, most of the people he gave antidepressants to, chemical antidepressants, did become depressed again. And secondly, they were depressed and anxious for really understandable reasons, like they were lonely. So one day he decided to pioneer a different approach. A woman came to see him, who I got to know later, called Lisa Cunningham. And Lisa had been shut away in her home with just crippling depression and anxiety for 7 years. And Sam said to Lisa, don't worry, I'll carry on giving you these drugs, but I'm also going to prescribe something else. He prescribed for her, he said, I want you to come twice a week to these offices to meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people, not to talk about how shit you feel. You can do that if you want, but actually the point of it is so you can find something meaningful that you guys can do together. And the first time the group met, Lisa literally started vomiting with anxiety. It was just so overwhelming for her. But the group starts talking. They're like, what could we do? These are inner city East London people. Like me, they didn't know anything about gardening. But they were like, there was this big area behind the doctor's offices. They were like, we could turn that into a garden. So they started to read gardening books. They started to watch YouTube gardening instructions. They started to get their fingers in the soil. They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence that exposure to the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. But they started to do something even more important. They started to form a tribe. They started to form a group. When one of them didn't show up, the others would go looking for them, help them figure out what was going on, solve their problems. The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. This approach is called social prescribing. It costs absolutely nothing. It's spreading all over Europe. And there was a small study in Norway of a similar program, found it was more than twice as effective in reducing anxiety as chemical antidepressants. And this is something I saw all over the world, from Sydney to San Francisco to Sao Paulo. The most effective strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the underlying reasons why people feel this way. And that, to me, again, social prescribing is so important, because it's not about saying to the isolated individual, you've got to take responsibility for your own behavior, pull yourself together. Again, I'm not imputing this view to you. I know this is not what you think either. Pull yourself together, get out there, take responsibility. To me, that you could have said that to Lisa and it would have just made her more depressed. It's about giving people routes to reconnection, paths to reconnection that usually require some kind of collective action. Not always, sometimes an individual can do it on their own, but mostly you need that kind of collective action. Individuals can take personal responsibility with support. Without support, what can you do? You know, isolated, depressed people interacting through screens, taught that life is all about money and showing off, are going to be depressed and anxious most of the time, right?
Check out my next video here. What lies beneath procrastination is nothing more than a fear of being rejected, a fear of not being good enough. And if you have that fear, you're in very good company. It's the most common fear in the world. So now you understand it. Okay, I'm lying